So, hello everybody, and welcome from Berlin from the Information and Competence Center for Sustainable Building. And welcome to our webinar today with a topic of instruments of climate mitigation on a citywide level. My name is Susanne Gallens. I'm going to moderate this webinar today, and I am here on behalf of my company, Zebau, which is the Center for Energy, Building, Architecture and Environment in Hamburg. And we are in charge of a program here in the Efficiency House Plus in Berlin. So since our experts today are from outside Germany, the webinar will obviously be in English and not in German. So to all our German listeners, I hope that's okay. One little comment on the side, you all can see a chat window, which is like kind of in the middle, kind of right-ish of your screen. And you can write your comments in there, you can ask questions. So if you can't hear us properly, if you can't see us or our presenters somehow, please just write in this chat window and let us know, and we will try to fix it as quickly as we can. And yeah, especially also ask questions. So during the presentations, you're welcome to ask questions, write your comments, share maybe your experiences with us. And we will ask those questions after the presentations to the experts, and then they will answer your questions accordingly. So today we chose this topic because we think it is good to start developing sustainable buildings like the Efficiency House Plus, where we are right now in Berlin. But it is even more important to look at the whole and the broader scale of those things if we want to have a sustainable building future. So the whole city has to be considered in our work and in our daily efforts, and we have to tackle our challenges like the climate change on the city level and work with the networks within the cities, use synergies, and use all the possibilities we have in the cities. And I'm very, very happy that we have several experts today presenting to you from Torino in Italy and also from Toronto in Canada. So the first presentation, you will see the program right now for our webinar. The first presentation will be from Torino, and we're very happy to have Liliana Mazza and Chiara Lucini and Simone Mangili from the city of Torino with us today, who will present their master plan from the city of Turin to you, and also the integration of the environmental aspects into this master plan, and also talk about adaptation plan that goes along with it. And in the second presentation, we will have Sibel Kadavi and Katie Whitman from Toronto with us. Also very happy to have you guys here. And they will come from the more broader topic of a master plan that we look at in Torino to a more specific topic, which will be the cycling network plan. So we look at sustainable and green mobility aspects and strategies. And yeah, we will look at this progressive and innovative approach of Toronto and how which benefits it has, what challenges came up, and about the data-driven modeling that was behind the whole plan. Yeah, so that's enough from my side, I think. I don't want to bother you with all the introduction too long. So I'm very happy to welcome Chiara now and Simone and maybe Liliana. I can't see her right now, but I'm happy to say hello to our Italian friends from Torino and pass the word right now. So enjoy the presentation from Torino.
Hello, can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Yes, so good afternoon. I'm Chiara. Liliana will join us soon, and by my side there's Simone. So we will try and give you an introduction on two consistent planning tools the city of Torino is working on. I will start with a general presentation about how the city of Torino is redesigning and rethinking its general master plan. And then Simone will focus more on the climate change action plan that the city is delivering. Liliana will probably join the conversation along the afternoon, and I hope she will be together with us at your disposability to answer to your questions and to get more in detail about the contents of this work. We have been collecting for you a few data in our presentation about Torino, just to give you an idea of the processes, the transition processes that the city has been facing during the last 30 years, more or less. The city of Torino has grown in modern times all around car production and actually the development, the physical and socioeconomical development of the city has been closely and has been influenced by let's say the story of industrial production in the metropolitan area. The city has faced an important industrial crisis starting from, let's say, the end of the 70s, and this has in some way influenced its recent history until now, with a general decrease in the population, much more in the core than in the metropolitan ring, and with the general change of the demographics, with a growing number of elderly people, with a growing number of fragilities that in some way became visible and important in the development of the city starting from the second half of the 80s. We collected also a number of economic figures that in some way are quite important for us to also show you, let's say, the economical ecosystem of the city, which is currently suffering for a growing unemployment rate, especially between the youngsters. So people around 24, 30 years of age are facing big problems in finding an occupation in the city, and this is becoming an issue. Kind of interesting, if we talk about this, is the fact that the post-industrial transition of the city has been in some way changed the economical base of the city. So in the 70s, more than the 60% of the workers were employed in production. Nowadays, more than the 65% of the workers are employed in services, but we haven't been so good, let's say, at fighting unemployment rates, and we haven't been so good at stabilizing the jobs market. So these are in some way some of the most critical points that we have to highlight as we talk about our current economic conditions. In the image you can see here now, this is an image which is dating back to the, let's say, in between the 60s and the 80s. This is quite well known locally, let's say, because this is showing the moment of maximum expansion, both in physical terms and in economic terms, of what we call the industrial system in Torino. I'm sure you all know that Torino is the hometown of FCA, once known as Fiat, and actually all the violet areas that you can see in this map were in some way, in the majority of the cases, bound to the production that was brought about by Fiat. So all the components of cars, all the things that you needed to build a car were produced locally or in the metropolitan area. This system gets into a crisis between the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, as I told you before, and brings a number of implications in the economic, in the urban system that, of course, have to do with socioeconomic conditions, but which also has to do quite a lot with the physical appearance and with the physical balance of the city. In this second map, you can see all the black dots are in some way showing industrial pressings that were established in the city and that still were there during the 80s. And the size of the dots is showing you the size in square meters of these pressings. And as you can see, these are quite close to the city center. So just to show you, I don't know if you can see my arrow, my mouse, but I'm showing you the central part of the city. And as you can see, many of these, thank you, many of these, there we go. Many of these pressings I'm telling you about were quite proximate to the city center. So the city master plan that was delivered at the beginning of the 90s was actually one of the main planning tools that was delivered by the city, by the public authority in order to react to this to the consequences of the industrial crisis. And actually, one of the main, let's say, one of the main aims of this plan was in some way rethink or provide new visions and new functions and new rules for the redevelopment of these brownfields that were occupying a total surface of more than 10 million square meters. So quite an important portion of the urban land. So that master plan is currently ongoing, let's say, because it was approved in 1992, and its rules, of course, they have been adjusted and upgraded a long time, but they are still working nowadays. So with, of course, as you can imagine, a number of critical points, because those rules were built for let's say, a context which has changed a long time, and now those rules need to be updated. Just to give you an example, which is kind of meaningful as we go through the main topic of this webinar, 30 years ago, the environmental issues were not at the top of the list in the minds of those ones that were in some way thinking of redesigning the city. So this is just an example, but just to let you understand that the idea of redesigning or rethinking or in some way rehabilitating, let's say, our city master plan is mainly guided by the fact that we are facing all the new problems, and we need to deliver and design new kind of tools to in some way to be capable to influence the way these kind of issues are treated at local level. So generally speaking, the main rationality of the plan is not going to be changed. So the plan was quite innovative at that time, so for the 90s, because it was saying really a lot of things about how each of these brownfields had to be transformed. It was one of the first plans in Italy which had to deal with shrinkage instead of dealing with expansion. And so a number of new rules for those times were invented or designed in order to push the urban transformation on, so to let these brownfields become something different. This was closely bound to, let's say, generally speaking, a political vision that was intending to let Torino become a more European capital. So the main idea was that these brownfields were to welcome all those new functions that needed to be settled in a future European capital. And actually, the main idea was that, I mean, one of the main principles that were guiding this process were that the urban changeover was realized that using or transforming private areas, because all the brownfields were in the hands of those companies that were producing in the city, trying to maximize the public effects of these processes. So trying to provide as more public space as we could, trying to provide new services and so forth and so on. Of course, this process was kind of controversial, and there's a lot of criticism now on the outcomes and on the way this process were brought about. We can talk about it later if you want. So as the city offices were starting to rethink of the general master plan, the first thing that they did was to, in some way, gather knowledge about the state of the art of the brownfields. So how many of these brownfields that were the core business of the city master plan were really transformed, in which way, and which kind of, let's say, new pieces of city they were producing. So the analysis, as you can see in these maps, I mean, they look very technical and kind of boring, but they say a lot of things. Well, the green ones are the areas that were actually implemented. The red ones, and as you can see in some parts of the city, especially this one, the one which is highlighted in the box on the right, The red ones are the ones that were not realized, that were not implemented. And in many cases, this was also due to the, let's say, to the physiognomy of private property in the city. Maybe we can talk about it later. Sorry, I'm stepping back just once, just for a couple of things more. So as this initial job of, let's say, establishing the state of the art of the process of urban transformation was extremely important for the municipality in order to understand, of course, on the one side, how many brownfield are we still, do we still have to cope with? And on the other side, trying to understand which were those cases that were more successful, and which are the problems that we have to face nowadays as we try to push the urban transformation forward. And this is particularly important if we think that Torino nowadays is a city in which the real estate market is very slow. Values are very low, but at the same time, there's not so much interest in investing in the city. So this big bunch of areas needs to be rethought on the one side, but it also needs to be repositioned in the market. So on the one side, of course, this idea of redesigning the plan is very technical. So we need to design new and better rules to let this process of urban transformation be controlled with less effort by the city offices. But on the other side, it was a big opportunity to think of new principles that could move let's say, yes, new principles that could guide the delivery of the urban transformation process in the city. In the column on your left, you can see there's a list of things. I can briefly translate them. These are the guiding principles that are in some way guiding the work in the city offices. As the first point, the environment is intended as a big resource, as an important thing. So this is in some way completing what was not told in the beginning in the master plan. Urban identity and well-being are again quite important points. The youngsters and their relationship with the city, production and the creation of new jobs, making the rules much more simple, and then relating to the metropolitan area. These big topics, big issues have been are going to be discussed at local level with a number of meetings that are taking place in the different neighborhoods, which is what you can see on the right part of the slide. So as we talk about the environmental chapter of our city master plan, as you can imagine, it's a big work that is in some way treating a number of policy fields. But as we talk about the main principles guiding the environmental chapters that have to do with how we want to rethink the urban transformation process in our city, there are some points which are key. On the one side, of course, the idea of reducing soil consumption, but also on the other side to increase the permeability of soils and the capability of our physical environment to respond to climate change. Improving air quality is extremely important for Torino because our morphological conditions are not helping us. Actually, we are surrounded by hills and mountains, and so and we are at the end of the Pianura Padana, so we produce a lot of emissions, but we also get many emissions from the other cities in the area. Energy efficiency improvement, again, is an important point, which is actually in the city agenda since quite a long time. So it has been in some way also integrated in this effort of redesigning the city master plan. And then, of course, working on mobility, increasing the use of soft mobility, increasing the use of public transportation. The city is working, of course, involving many different stakeholders, and an important thing is that the work that is being brought about at the moment is done by taking advantage of money coming from the European Union that are helping us, collecting the information we don't have, experimenting on specific parts of the city, the kind of policies that are going to be integrated in the city master plan. That's the case of the Politecnico di Torino, as we talk about other kind of actors that are involved in this process. And that's the case of the SESBAMED project, as we talk about European community funded programs that in some way are helping us also, locally generating that kind of knowledge that a municipality needs to understand the problems and then frame them the right way to let them become policy instruments, planning tools, and so forth and so on. So at the moment, the urban planning offices are working a lot on the point of view of indicators, so trying to highlight which are those points that are more interesting or more meaningful to be measured. And on the other side, experimentations are going to be put in place in specific areas in the city in order to understand how to, let's say, how to make the theory become practice and how to make these practices become the everyday rule that everybody has to follow as specific initiatives in the city are delivered. So I don't want to steal some time to Simone, because the climate change adaptation plan is going more in detail in specific actions. So we have been collecting for you just a few references about the main frameworks that in some way the city has to comply with. So the city of Torino, of course, can activate specific tools, can work on its rules, but there are some super local frameworks or level of planning that in some way need to be taken in account and that are actually not that innovative sometimes. So let's say that sometimes local planning is running much faster than regional or national strategies. Well, I don't know if I have more to show you, but I can. I mean, we can maybe skip it because I was in some way, generally speaking, touching all of these points. In this slide, as you can see, there's just we were just trying to summarize up which are the main areas that are going to be touched in the local experimentations in specific neighborhoods. So the indicators that we are trying to collect, as you can see, there's an example in the table on the bottom of the slide. So according to each of these let's say category, we are collecting a number of meaningful indicators that are going to be used to study the city as it is now, and that are going to, let's say, that are going to become tasks to be achieved or aims that the city is gonna pursue in its future action. I mean, here you can see, of course, as you can imagine, the work on indicators has been quite massive and complex, but the idea was in some way to highlight the ones that are most meaningful and the ones that are more capable also to help the local administration to achieve specific tasks like, for example, the reduction of the emissions, but not only. We are now working on highlighting the strengths and the opportunities and trying to, in some way, really test if this model is going to work at local level. But we are, let's say, we are on it. So we don't have so much to tell you about it because we are still working on the local analysis. So I'm done, let's say, and I'm gonna leave the stage to Simone. I hope it was not too boring and too long, but Simone will raise up the level of our conversation for sure.
Thank you, Chiara. I think the presentation is currently loading. I am aide to the mayor and staff to the deputy mayor for environment and sustainability policy. And I just wanted to pick up where Chiara left off. I think it's a very auspicious moment right now in the city because along with the revision of the master plan, we have the opportunity to take on three other significant planning processes. One which I'll talk to you about today, but the other two are just as significant, I think. One is the updating of the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, and the other is the development of a green infrastructure plan that we are leading as the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Environment and Sustainability. And then the third one is the one I'd like to talk to you today, which is the development of a climate adaptation strategy and plan for the city. So I will get right to it. We've launched a climate adaptation planning process early last year, and we're in the process of sort of wrapping up the main elements of analysis. In this slide, you can see the process we've gone through. We began with a vulnerability analysis, which I'll share with you the main results of, looking at the specific impacts of each of the risks that we face, and then also collectively at the cumulative and secondary risks. So we've completed that task. We also understand, though, that we need to sort of understand better how people are living climate change in our city, and so we're reaching out to communities to understand how extreme weather events are affecting life at the local neighborhood level. And then we're also embarking on something pretty innovative in terms of evaluating ecosystem services. So I'll go right ahead. I think this is a piece of our vulnerability analysis. I think some of the risks that we face are similar to those of many other cities around the world. We essentially see temperatures increasing more days in even the conservative scenarios at the higher end of the temperature range, and that temperature range increasing over time. So hotter days and more of them essentially is what's happening and what we predict to be happening in the future. And so two specific risks associated with that. One is heat waves, which affect generally most of the city overall. And the second is urban heat island, which I'm showing here the result of our analysis of. So what you see, this is a map of our city area, obviously. In green, the areas that are low risk. In light green, the areas that are, in green, the areas that are essentially no risk. In light green, the areas that are low risk. In orange, the medium risk, and in red, the high risk. So no surprise here that the higher risk areas are the industrial areas. So those areas that you see in dark red are the major industrial zones of the city. And the lower risk areas, the light green, I think what's interesting to point out here is most of the area that's adjacent to green infrastructure. So that's something that we need to take into account. And what's, I think, notable, aside from those 2 points, is that essentially the entire urban fabric, aside from the areas that are essentially adjacent to green infrastructure, are basically facing medium risk of heat islands, so heat island effects. So that's something that we need to take into account. This is an analysis showing exactly the correlation between the low risk areas and the green infrastructure in our city, and then the areas of least permeability as related to the medium and high risk. I point this out because these are the areas that we need to understand how to intervene in order to manage heat island effects based on our analysis. The second vulnerability that we've analyzed and the risk we've analyzed is the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme precipitation events. So we have just about the same amount of precipitation overall during the year, but concentrated in fewer events that are more intense. So you see what we see from this data is we have some events increasing from a maximum, say, of generally 20 to 30 millimeters of rainfall per hour to actually almost 40 or above 40 millimeters of rainfall per hour, which is creating very serious challenges for our local stormwater management infrastructure. Again, this is what we're seeing is the same amount of water generally, but in fewer events and more intense events. That combined with the fact that that our local context, as Chiara mentioned earlier, is one of surrounded by hills and mountains. So we're completely surrounded 270 degrees by the Alpine arc of the Alps, and to the east by the hills of Turin. And this creates a very complex hydrological system of which Turin is essentially the epicenter, with four main rivers traversing it. So when we have extreme weather events, we're not only experiencing what's happening locally, but what's happening in our entire watershed. And we can see the effects of that. As the city was being transformed in the 1990s, we also started to realize that the climate was changing. We had big floods over the resuming decades. And this is just a recent event not long ago, 2016, of what happens when we have extreme weather events combined with the complexity of the hydrology of the system. And these are the effects in the city center of Turin. So we know the impacts. These events are becoming more frequent. They're having more lasting effects. And we know that the impacts, we're already feeling them. In addition to the climate risks, we also have, as Chiara mentioned, the urban sort of socio-demographic factors, which create additional vulnerabilities. So we have an aging population, which is very clear from the charts in the upper right. And at the same time, we have a somewhat weakened social welfare system with, as a result of austerity measures and other national policy changes. So together, the vulnerabilities that we face from climate, combined with the vulnerabilities that we face from socioeconomic factors, are creating sort of the main issues that we need to address. So as I mentioned before, the other piece of the climate adaptation strategy plan that we are developing is a green infrastructure plan, and the climate adaptation plan and the green infrastructure plan intersect around what we are analyzing, which is ecosystem services. So we are currently performing an analysis with three main objectives of the ecosystem services produced, number one, by our green infrastructure system. So all of our parks, all of our green space, all of our urban forest, and all of the sort of ornamental and residual green space in the city, to understand how to best maximize the functioning of that green infrastructure, to contrast some of the impacts and the vulnerabilities, and adapt that green infrastructure to better perform in the future. We're also looking to essentially analyze where we can develop more ecosystem service function, even outside of the areas where our green infrastructure currently is, in order to contrast climate impacts and vulnerabilities. So for instance, if we look back at the map of heat island effects, the areas that were in orange are areas where we are looking to try and maximize the development of new green infrastructure to shade and to provide climate refuges during heat waves and to protect from heat island effects. So that's the second objective of our ecosystem service analysis. And the third one is to develop a tool that allows us essentially to calculate ecosystem services either lost or gained from new urban transformations as a part of the new urban master plan that we're developing at the moment. So the ecosystem services that we're looking at are a number of them. They're carbon sequestration, temperature moderation, so it's allowing so the ability of the environment to essentially relieve the heating that's happening at the local level, the capturing of air pollution, so PM10s and 2.5s, soil stabilization in our hillsides where extreme weather events can cause instability and landslides, stormwater management to essentially better manage the precipitation events in our city, so more permeable surfaces, as Chiara mentioned earlier, but not only more engineered surfaces to better manage or slow runoff into the system, increased or the quality of habitat and biodiversity and how that may change over time with climate change, and then the social benefits of our green infrastructure system. So we are in the process of evaluating those, but at the same time, We're also moving ahead in the planning process. So in parallel, we're developing a forest management plan for our eastern hills based on these ecosystem services and the maximization of these ecosystem services, a plan that will be certified in sustainable management. We are also working with private partners to essentially engage in reforestry and urban forestry projects, such as the one here in the picture. But we're also engaging directly with citizens in planting new urban forests. This is an image of tree plantings that we have been doing with citizen groups and citizen volunteers twice a year, every year for the past few years. We've planted over 2,000 trees in different parts of the city, and now we're calculating the ecosystem services that are produced by those actions. In addition to that, we're also looking at the indirect and secondary and cumulative risks for our area. As Chiara mentioned, we have significant difficulties with air quality as it is. Specifically, there is a temperature inversion that happens during the winter that reduces the elevation at which the air essentially is refreshed and is able to dilute the pollutants and emissions in our atmosphere. It's reduced in winter, so it gets very compacted close to the ground level. And so we have air quality problems that we're addressing, we've been addressing for many years. In addition to those, though, when we look at the effects of climate change, we do have, in terms of the heat component, we do have greater periods of drought, more intense precipitation, but in fewer events. So more periods with less rain, and then more drastic and extreme rain when it comes. And so I'm showing here a picture of an event that occurred 2 years ago when essentially we were already suffering from poor air quality because of the temperature inversion. And at the same time, drought was persistent drought for a number of months actually led to the breakout of wildfires in our valleys nearby, which created way more emissions, obviously, in particulate matter. And those two things combined created an emergency situation for us here in Turin. So we already had the air quality problem. We have the climate, the drought, and potential wildfire issue. Those two things combined to create an emergency situation. That's what we are looking at in terms of indirect and secondary and cumulative risks. So we're performing that level of analysis as we speak. I mentioned the sociological analysis that we're launching at the moment to better understand how our vulnerable populations and our vulnerable communities fare through these extreme weather events, whether they be heat-oriented or precipitation-oriented. And so we are in sort of face-to-face outreach with the community, trying to understand how these events are experienced by the more vulnerable members of our community, to sort of verify whether our actions that we're developing are really reaching the most vulnerable populations in our city. I mentioned before the mainstreaming of the plan. Actually, I mentioned before the opportunity that we have with the various plans currently underway. This climate adaptation strategy, along with the green infrastructure plan, along with the sustainable urban mobility plan, will all be attachments, will all be part and parcel of the new revised general master plan. So it's a very unique opportunity we have to mainstream these planning efforts. And then the last thing I'll mention is that at a certain point, we also have to realize that our climate challenges are not specific to just our metropolitan area or even our region for that matter. We are very closely intertwined economically and socially and many other levels with nearby cities, main cities, including Milan and Genova. So we're starting to look at how the vulnerabilities created by climate change, and not only climate change, can essentially how these can impact the broader macro regional area, and how these different types of vulnerabilities can interact with the climate vulnerabilities that we face locally. So we're in the process of we've already started working on developing this vulnerability analysis at a macro regional scale, which will lead us to identify some actions that we can undertake locally to better prepare for crises that may not even necessarily be generated locally. So I tried to give an overview there. We can of all of the sort of planning process and the different aspects that we're currently analyzing, but we are also somewhat far along in our sort of identification of priority actions, which is something we can also discuss if there's time. Thank you.
Okay. Well, can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much, Simone and Chiara, for those really, really interesting presentations. When you showed those photos with the flooding, Simone, I felt like we're right back in Hamburg where I work. So it's like, it seems we have the same problems in a lot of cities and a lot of challenges that we can learn from each other and see how other people tackle it and how other people or cities work with those challenges. So for everyone who's listening, you still have a chance now to pose questions in our chat room if you have any questions to Simone or Chiara. Maybe in the meantime, I can ask some questions to you because there's some things that still popped up in my head when you talked. For example, I'm really curious how you basically make the planners in Torino also accept the measures or the like things you propose in the master plan or the adaptation plan, because in Germany we always have issues with, for example, our master plans, they're not like legally binding like the planning law in Germany. So sometimes it's a bit tricky to make the actual planners who do the local plans to really like follow what we propose in the master plans. So do you have any recommendations, or how do you usually, like, do you train the planners somehow? Is there like little seminars with the planners, or how do you like come from a big plan to the local plan? Oh, could you activate your microphone, please? Yeah, perfect.
Sorry. There we go.
Better. So I'll give it a shot, and Chiara can jump in too. So I think we're lucky to a certain extent because our general master plan is law. And that's why I think it's key when I say that the opportunity that we have right now in terms of integrating the climate adaptation strategy, the green infrastructure plan, and the sustainable urban mobility plan with the general master plan, because those two instruments, at least the green infrastructure plan and the adaptation strategy, are not formally urban law or urban tools instruments. But as they are integrated into the urban master plan, they can become, they gain in significance, and they gain in even sort of importance at the local level. So I think we are lucky that that planning is law here, and it's very strict law. Actually, yeah. It's very significant. But aside from that, I think there's a different question at the basis of your question, which is how do we raise awareness and how do we build the skills to really address some of these challenges in the planning staff, and I dare say even in our green and Parks and Rec department, and even in our environmental services department, because it's, I think, fair to say that the new solutions that we're looking at to address some of these problems, the strategies that we have to put in place, are new for us locally, and there is a fair amount of training and professional capacity building that needs to be done. So when we look at nature-based solutions as a way of managing stormwater, or when we look at the development of green infrastructure to maximize ecosystem services, for instance, to moderate temperature, I think how to do that is still something that we have to work quite a bit at. When we work with our transportation engineers and say, you know, in this area, we'd like to develop this type of green infrastructure to achieve these kinds of ends, there are questions. How do you engineer that? What materials do you use? Who's done this, and how do we essentially ensure that we are compliant with local laws in the process? And so I think the question about capacity building and professional development is a very important one for us locally.
So if I may add my 2 cents to Simone's position, so let's say, bad sides of having the master plan as a law. This is a very, I mean, it is a long-term tool, so which is good on the one side, but on the other side, then you have the problem that it has also got a very long timing in, designing, approval, and adoption. Which means that as you are delivering it, the world around you is changing, which is precisely what happened with the one which is ongoing now. Then on the other side, if I totally agree with Simone when he says that we also need to train our offices, let's say, or the people, the city officers that are going to bring change about on the one side. But then on the other side, and actually, well, it is the side on which I'm working more, we also have to find the way to explain this process to the local ecosystem of stakeholders. So simply saying we want to reduce emissions, okay, this is a great slogan, and we can all agree on that. But then you have to change, people's everyday life, and this is far more difficult. And of course, this implies some efforts from any side, but also it implies, I think, a significant effort in, let's say, translating, explaining, and making these concepts that sometimes can be kind of, not so attracting, let's say, making them accessible to the general public. Otherwise, I mean, you can design the perfect tool, but then, and I'm not simply talking about, local communities or citizens that can, of course, have a say, but you also have to change the mindsets of professionals, of businesses, of those ones that then can invest money in transforming the city. And which is, again, another, let's say, the other side of generating new local base.
I actually see that we have another question from one of our participants here. He asks, do you fear a decline in construction and renovation measures due to higher requirements? And does the city of Turin have any special subsidy programs to compensate for additional costs for building owners?
So the first part of the question, we do not fear any decline because it is already declining, actually. So, I mean, this is a joke, but not completely a joke. So the city of Torino has faced a significant increase in, new building initiatives, let's say between the second half of the 90s and the early 2000s. You probably know that we had the Olympic Games on 2006, and many scholars agree on having that year as, in some way, the ending of an urban transformation cycle in the city. After that, the global crisis came, and a number of things occurred, not only at local level, and influenced and heavily conditioned also the way we plan our city today, and the fact that I mentioned before that the city hasn't got such an exciting real estate stage, let's say. So the new measures, the general idea in redefining the rules is to make them more understandable and more, much easier to be implemented, actually. So not to make it more complicated for the people to comply with a different kind of standards or whatever. So this is in principle, and this is what the city offices are trying to do. So make rules simpler as we integrate new things that were not in the rules before. A big part of this effort is integrating documents that you usually have to present to different offices. So, relating to different kind of people, complying with different levels of frameworks of rules and so forth and so on. Then the second part of the question, and I'm sure that after that Simone will have to add on that, but the second part of the question, we have some incentives also at national level that are in some way, let's say, inviting people to, I don't know, changing windows or working on the energy consumption of buildings and flats and so forth and so on. So at national level and at regional level, we already have some tools. I'm not so sure that the city can count on financial availability in establishing specific and dedicated tools at the moment, but who knows?
Sure, I'll just add two thoughts. One, maybe slightly from a more political perspective. I think to a certain extent, it's true that we're a much slower construction market than we were. It's also true that I think the redevelopment process was at a scale and at a pace that was relatively unheard of in Italy and is probably enviable in many other parts of Europe, at least. So there was a very, very significant construction process and reconstruction process, and that has clearly slowed down. But it was exceptional in and of itself, that process. At the same time, I have to say it's been a number of years that our urban planning code, our building code incorporates some significant energy efficiency standards related to the performance of those buildings. And over the past, I want to say it's at least 6-7 years that the code includes these measures. And in that process, every new urban development has had to meet far stricter energy efficiency standards. And there are incentives in the sort of in the dues that developers pay to build in the city, which the city can use to essentially incentivize even greater efficiency. So I think one of the key points that the new updated master plan will add to that code are related to stormwater management, to permeability of soils, and to the lack of soil consumption. So I think we started from, let's say, in this past phase of urban transformation with very frenetic, dizzying almost phase of construction and redevelopment. I think that's stabilized now to a certain extent. It's already integrated a significant amount of energy efficiency and energy performance standards in the building codes, and now we're looking to integrate that further with more incentives and parameters for
Thank you so much.
stormwater
Well,
management.
it's really interesting, your approach and yeah, your ideas and your progressive way to approach these things. I'm a little envious that you can have this plan as a law because that makes some things easier, I guess. But yeah, I wish you a lot of luck with the implementation of the plan and your great ideas that you have, and with making the planners move along with your ideas. So thank you very much again for this really interesting presentation. And looking at the time, I think we should move over to the next presentation. So bye-bye to Torino. Thank you very much. Grazie. And yeah, now I would like to welcome Sibel and Katie from Toronto. I hope you're here and that you can hear us right now. We're just quickly switching the presentations to your presentation. And yeah, like I said, now we're moving from the master plan to the more specific topic of mobility, specifically the bike mobility. And yeah, I'm very happy to have both of you here. Thanks again for agreeing to this and being part of this webinar. I can see you. I think I can hear you too. So I think we're good to go.
Yeah, how?
I think we can hear you very well.
So we'll leave like this?
Perfect. Very well. So I give the word to you.
Great. Thank you, Susanna. I'm Katie, and today
I think now I can't hear you anymore.
Oh.
Now I can hear you. I don't know.
Maybe I just need to speak slower.
Like this should be fine. Like right now we can hear you very well. So let's hope it stays like this.
Okay, we'll try not to move. So our presentation today is about the cycling network plan update that we undertook for the city of Toronto, which is Canada's largest city. And it's one of our key strategies for shifting the transportation trends away from vehicular traffic and carbon emissions towards more active, sustainable transportation, such as cycling. The original plan is only a few years old. It was approved by our city council in 2016, and there was significant public consultation undertaken for this original plan, including a survey with over 10,000 respondents, a digital mapping exercise with 7,000 respondents, 8 public drop-in events, 12 workshops, 6 bike rides, 90,000 trips from our cycling app, Cycle Toronto ward audits, and Cycle Toronto is the main advocacy organization for cycling here. And politically, our city is divided into 25 wards, each with an elected city councillor. And then there was also what we call a speed dating style event with Cycle Toronto ward captains, where they each got, I think it was 20 minutes with transportation staff to highlight their priorities and their recommendations for the plan. We still have all of those results from the consultation, and we feel that much of it is still very relevant today, as it's only a couple of years old. But we wanted to do some additional targeted stakeholder engagement as part of this update. So we worked closely with staff from other units and divisions, such as those in city planning, which is separate from us in transportation services, but we have a good working relationship with that division. And we collaborated with other groups such as the public health team, the environment and energy division, social development. We reached out to Cycle Toronto again and gave them more opportunities to provide input and to participate in mapping workshops. Something new that we coordinated this time was engagement with neighborhood planning tables. And these are groups of residents, agencies, businesses, and local councillors that represent communities of lower income and greater disparity in terms of economic opportunities, social development, access to transportation and public spaces. They were established through the work of the Social Development Division at the city. And so we worked with their leads to attend their existing meetings and held mapping activities focused on key neighborhood destinations and barriers at accessing them by bike or on foot. And I'll talk more about these activities shortly. And then we also met with each city councillor individually for a detailed briefing. And we held a presentation and question and answer session with a large group of external stakeholders who are the leads of many organizations in Toronto that do work in active transportation. So this map is showing the results of all those mapping exercises that are summarized by the green lines, which are over 5,000 routes that participants suggested, and the purple lines are our existing cycling routes. And so we took all of these and ran them through our updated cycling impact analysis, our safety analyses, and our equity analysis, which Sibel will describe in more detail in a moment. And we did some parallel checks on our own analyses with other sources of data. And then we presented the results in a scorecard format, which means instead of only providing one sum, we wanted to be more transparent and show the results in each individual category, as well as one weighted sum version that we did. We reviewed the feasibility of the highest priorities in terms of what can actually fit in the road or what the impacts would be. And we matched, wherever possible, the timing of our work with existing plans for road reconstructions and resurfacing. And we call that our capital coordination process. We also did some high-level budget estimates for implementation. And then those ones, we got into more detail for those that we were seeing in the near-term program, the ones that we could confirm the feasibility and coordinate with the road work. And then those not falling into that category have been maintained in this long list of longer-term proposed routes that we didn't get to do all the detailed feasibility analysis for, but we'll talk about that process of how we move from the proposed to the program after we hear about all the data from today.
Right. Thanks, Judy. So in order to assess the value of each of the 5,000 proposed routes and the value they bring to the actual network, they were evaluated against these 9 criteria, with each receiving a score out of 4. So in essence, there was a multi-criteria analysis that was performed on each of these proposed routes. And the color scheme shows which categories were enhanced since the previous cycling network plan, with the dark green representing major enhancements, light green minor, light blue staying consistent, and orange being equity, a new analysis category. So in absence of citywide cycling volume information, in order to see the nuances of cycling demand at the street level, current cycling demand was modeled using road network routing of origin and destination data from the 2016 Transportation Tomorrow survey using current cycling trips. So the Transportation Tomorrow survey is Toronto's travel survey, and it's taken every 5 years and is by a representative sample of Toronto residents across the city. And it's just used to gain an understanding of their travel patterns. So from this, we had 70,000 unique origin destination pairs representing cycling trips, and they were modeled along the road network to sort of help estimate cycling volume on each road segment. So how we did this is we mapped all the potential origin destinations from the travel survey. These are all the orange dots that you see on the map on the left. And we know the number of cycling trips that are made between those 2 points. And so we used ArcMap's network analyst to draw the routes between those points along the network, and using and tweaking the modeling to avoid steep grades and attraction on cycling infrastructure to sort of best model reflect cyclists' actual routes and trip behavior. So all these 70,000 drawn routes were overlaid, and then estimated cycling volume was calculated at the segment level. And after some internal checks, we compared it against our counts that we did, particularly downtown, and it was surprisingly accurate. And on the right, you see an example of the modeling that we did between those 2 points and the route that was drawn. And for potential and this is the result of the actual analysis. So blue is showing where the lower cycling volume is estimated in the city, and red is the high. So this helps give us support for cycle infrastructure installation along these corridors, and especially if there are trade-offs, such as parking removal or removal of lanes of traffic. So it helps support our plans. And potential cycling demand was similarly done to current cycling demand, but instead using network routing of origin destination data of trips we think we can convert from vehicular trips to cycling, or not just vehicular, also long walking trips. So these are vehicular and public transit trips 5 kilometers and under, and long walking trips 1 kilometer and higher. So we found where those are, and then we mapped it across the network. And in the red areas, we saw where that potential is highest for cycling conversion. And next, the trip generator category, it scores proposed routes based on the density of destinations that are important for meeting daily needs, which it serves. So on the right, it shows the type of destinations that were selected for the analysis, and transit wasn't included in this analysis because it was pulled out and put in its own separate analysis category for emphasis. Next, transit access. So in order to encourage cycling access to rail and transit stations, the routes between people's homes and the station need to be continuously safe. So even just a small break of perceived or actual safety is enough to deter most of the population from cycling, especially in Toronto, where where rail stations are planned, and these are just off of major arterials typically, which are not comfortable for cycling because of the fast cars and just generally limited separation between cycling and vehicles. So what this transit analysis does is identifies the streets that are modeled to carry the highest number of commuters within a cyclable distance around between their home and the closest public transit station, so that it can be assessed whether the routes there are continuously safe or not. So for cyclable distance, we use a buffer of 2 kilometers for metro stations and 3 kilometers for higher speed rail stations. And this helps with the phasing of cycling infrastructure implementation by using sort of this demand-based approach for cycling planning, for cycling project phasing. And how we did this is we estimate the population in each home in that sort of catchment area, cyclable catchment area, and we gave a higher weighting for like higher density buildings, and then we ran a betweenness analysis using MIT's Urban Network Analyst Toolbox, and that traces each commuter's route from their home to the station and then sums the number of times each road segment is crossed to arrive at a total modeling volume for each road segment. And next, you'll see the results for one of our GO stations, one of our rail stations, and the red roads are where most cyclists are concentrated, and blue the lowest. And so this sort of just gives us an idea of like where to start first, like where to start building continuous safe infrastructure first if it does not exist. And it's also useful, like if you're trying to identify what the best access is for the station and for planning bike parking capacity, for example, like which side would be the most traveled to enter the station. Next, the connectivity criteria scored proposed routes higher if the bridge is a gap in the existing cycling network, because that we found that was quite important for people. Next is network coverage. So this criteria, routes were scored higher if the proposed route is outside a 250-meter area around existing cycling infrastructure. So for downtown, it was 500 meters. And, 250 meters, and for the outer area is 500 meters. That's like in the more suburban area of Toronto. So implying a 500-meter grid of cycling infrastructure in our sort of like downtown core area, and that's this area that you see at the bottom. And this is our more suburban area. So next is barrier crossing. So we scored routes higher if it crossed a barrier such as rails, rivers, highways, light rail corridors, like any sort of infrastructure or feature that sort of limits a cycling access for crossing. And lastly, the last criteria I talked about is safety. So we scored the routes based on the number of cycling collisions that happened between 2012 and 2017 along these proposed routes. So the collisions were assigned based on whether they were at an intersection or a mid-block location, and then these mid-block and intersection locations were ranked against each other and put into quartiles and then ranked against each other. So you can identify then the most unsafe mid-block and intersection location. So the proposed infrastructure was given a higher score if it crosses the higher collision segments and intersections. And next, I'll give it back to Katie to talk about equity.
Thanks, Belle. So the City of Toronto has an equity lens tool that staff are encouraged to use. Think very carefully through the purposeful, but also the potential unintended consequences of city projects on the most vulnerable populations in our city. So for this cycling network plan update, we wanted to think both qualitatively and quantitatively about how we could prioritize equity in our work how we could prioritize neighborhoods that are both historically and currently the most disadvantaged in our city. So we prepared giant maps of each of the neighborhood improvement areas and attended their existing neighborhood meetings once each and asked participants to show us on the maps where the important destinations and community hubs are in their neighborhoods and the places serving daily needs. We did have many of the destinations on the map already from our open data sources, but we asked them to give us a sense of the most important and the most popular, and then to spot any that were missing, places that wouldn't be captured in open data, but were really important to the community. And we want to use this information to ensure that when routes are planned in the neighborhoods, that they don't just cut through them or have a feeling of serving people passing by. We want it to really connect the residents to the places that they want and need to go and make it clear that the routes are for them. And we'll do more detailed engagement when specific projects come up in their neighborhoods because this exercise was still quite high level. This is a map showing the equity index, which was developed by our social development division. And the darkest orange is showing the areas most in need. And those highlighted in yellow are those that were below the threshold and identified as the priority neighborhood improvement areas. And so those are the areas that have the planning tables that we were attending. And then this is a map that our group made where we overlaid the equity index with what we called our cycling service score. And the cycling service is the proportion of streets in the neighborhood that have bike routes. And so we can see when they're overlaid, those neighborhoods in the darkest red are the ones that are disadvantaged both from the equity index perspective, but also in terms of having the least cycling infrastructure. And so we know that these are areas that we need to pay some extra attention to in our programming. Oh, and that was some of the notes, part of the legend for the map. So the structure of our plan now consists of a rolling 3-year implementation program where we were able to confirm feasibility and coordinate with the road program. And then the rest of the suggestions are maintained in an undefined proposed long-term cycling network, which serves more as a vision. And it's where we draw the next batch of projects each year from that proposed into the implementation program. So as an example, it's actually not super clear, but this is one of the maps. We have 4 maps for our 4 districts. So the city of Toronto geographically, in addition to having the 25 wards, we're also split into 4 districts: Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough, and Toronto East York. And so we made one map for each to show the near-term program in terms of the new routes planned for 2019 to 2021, what we call renew routes, which are existing routes that we're going to upgrade or improve in some way. And then there was also a category of study, which are some of the really complex proposals where work will be initiating in this near-term program, but actual construction would come after. So they're just in the study category at this stage. Overall, across the 4 districts, the near-term program includes about 120 kilometers of new cycling infrastructure, and the Renew program is in addition to that, and the studies are in addition to that. But one thing to note about the way we count the kilometers, in case this is different across other countries or cities, is for the on-street facilities, if we're building infrastructure on both sides, each side is counted. And then if it's a trail, I think it's specifically our trails, we count them just as center line because they're just ones. So just to put that in context in terms of the distance we're talking about. This is the vision map. It's quite overwhelming and intentionally so, because one of the main things we wanted to convey with this is that so many streets are on the table in terms of being considered as cycling routes, because all of these ones scored reasonably well in the analysis. They showed value to a cycling network. And we've presented them using the analysis scores. So this particular map doesn't have the scorecard breakdown. We do have maps for each category individually, but this one we did sum the scores together to give some sense of priority, so that when we're talking about routes that we're considering, we don't just give one map with basically every street in the entire city shown. We can talk about the red being the ones that were scoring the highest, look in more detail at what those categories were showing, and make some informed proposals about our prioritization. This is another map that we included as an illustration of our major citywide cycling routes. So these are also captured in the other maps, either in the near term or the long term. But we wanted to draw this one out to make it clearer to the public that we are working towards the backbone of the cycling network with high order infrastructure and routes that go from north to south and east to west. And then the other routes are providing the local connections to and around these. But we wanted to be able to convey this grid that we're building of the major routes. So in terms of going from that proposed to the program, each year, because it's a rolling 3-year implementation program, we'll program another year out. And a big driving force for us with the 3-year timeline is because that's what matches our confirmed road program. So we know for 2019, 2020, and 2021 where the reconstructions and the resurfacings are happening, so that we can coordinate or sequence with those. And then we get the information about 2022 and get to start working on that now. And so we look at the scorecard results in terms of priorities from the analysis. We look at that road program and where we have matches or mismatches. We look at if we can actually fit the cycling infrastructure on the best route in terms of the analysis, or if it doesn't fit now, what would it take? Would it take parking removal? Would it take a lane reduction? Would we need to move curbs, remove trees, utility poles? We want to document all of that clearly. And as part of that, include a cost estimate, because we do have a set budget for each year. And that plays a big role in where we have to make the cutoff in terms of how much in 1 year we can do. And then we also want to pay attention to what we call neighborhood clustering, which is where we want to, for streamlining and for connectivity, we want to do some routes together that are building off each other, where we can do the consultations together and our reporting requirements, because we still have to go back to our city council to get approval to install the routes. We get approval in principle for the framework that we've proposed for the plan at that high level, and then we actually still have to go back to get approval to build after we've demonstrated that we've done the public consultation and have the support and the detailed design. And on top of that, we want to keep an eye on the geographic and equitable distribution of these projects. So in one given year, we may be focusing on a few neighborhoods to do the clusters, but then we want to watch that over the course of the 3 years and onwards, are we giving attention to the neighborhood improvement areas that we looked at, to different areas of the city? We want to be sure that we're not focusing all of our attention just in the downtown, for example. And that is all the content we had planned, but I think there's time for questions, and Isabel and I will try to field those. Yeah.
Okay, thank you too very, very much for this interesting presentation. I'm very glad to see that not just in those typical European countries like Denmark or the Netherlands, there's a lot of progress moving forward with the traffic, considering bike planning, but also in Canada. So this is very interesting, very innovative, and very detailed how you approach this whole topic. So I'm very impressed. We actually already have a question here in our chat room about your presentation. Thorsten would like to know, what is the current significance of a bicycle in the traffic mix in Toronto right now? And what are the goals for the future? Do you have any numbers, I guess, as the questions? And can you say something about the definition of cycling distance that you chose? And he also says that it seems to him that it's a little bit conservative or rather conservative, and also have e-bikes being considered in that context, because I guess he means it's probably different distances, different circumstances when you talk about electric bikes. So yeah, maybe you can say something about those questions.
Definitely, it's a great question. It actually varies a lot throughout Toronto. So, in terms of our cycling mode share, if you average Toronto on the whole, I believe we're at 2.7% for our cycling mode share. But then if you look at our downtown core and a certain neighborhood,
you maybe move a
some
bit
of these
forward to the microphone. Sorry.
a little closer. So some neighborhoods in Toronto have over 10%, but the average is about because it includes our more suburban area.
Still can't hear you. I don't know why. Maybe you need to move to the side. Or maybe it's
okay. I wonder.
Now I can.
I'll just like touch.
That sounds better. Yeah.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it sounds good. I think we're good now.
Okay. Okay, we're good. So the bicycle is very significant in our downtown area, where we have mode shares over 20%. Our average across the whole city is much lower. We don't have as many people cycling yet in our more suburban region. So the mode shares out there are significantly lower. But downtown, when you step out during rush hour, there are crowds of bikes going through along our major commuter routes. And I would say it just keeps growing, that it's becoming even more significant. In terms of goals, we actually, there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not we should define some target mode shares. I believe Montreal, one of our other Canadian cities, has 15% target for their cycling mode share. I think we struggle with the target because there's so much variation across our city. We want to grow it, and there is actually one target from our climate action strategy called Transform TO, and in that, I believe the target is that 75% of trips under 5 kilometers will be walked or biked. So they actually group walking and cycling together. But the emphasis here in terms of cycling distance, a very sort of recognizably and understood distance for cycling is the 5 kilometer mark. There's certainly plenty of people who bike more. And the piece about e-bikes, we are starting to see more. I don't think we're at like European levels of e-bikes, but there've been consultations starting to happen about like different types and which ones will be allowed in the bike lanes versus some of the more like almost mini motorcycles are not allowed in the bike lanes. So it's an emerging conversation here, and I think it will start to change the perception of a normal cycling distance, which may start to take us beyond the 5 kilometer mark in the future.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Maybe one more question. Do you have issues with the traffic planners in your city? Because sometimes traffic planners are rather conservative, at least in Germany that's sometimes the case. So they're very focused on the cars and how we can make our streets and cities perfect for the car usage, but are not really on board yet with focusing more on the bicycle traffic. Do you have any like tips for our other cities? Like, do you have any ideas how you tackle those problems or challenges?
I'll add something. Okay. Yes, I think that has been a larger problem in the past. I think we're getting to a point where it's becoming common knowledge and understood we need to work towards complete streets. A popular term being used in Canada is complete streets, which means that we're not just planning for the car, but it's complete in terms of being safe for people walking, for people cycling, for people taking transit. And so I think there is still some resistance that we're working through because engineering has focused on vehicles for so long, and this is the norm, this is a change. But we have, at least among our colleagues and a lot of the people that we work with, there's an understanding that we need to start sharing that space, that the space doesn't belong to vehicles. But you can add.
Yeah, because part of particularly for the transit access piece, we did there's an economic benefit to that, because if you're not providing for cycling access to get the riders to the station, you have to build perhaps more expensive infrastructure. And we've seen, like, if you add in a car parking space, like the construction maintenance of just one parking space for one user for the whole day is $50,000. So if you can improve cycling access, to the station, it just makes more economic sense. So, like, if you try and use more economic related arguments, it helps drive the conversation to say improving cycling infrastructure, like around those cycling distances around stations, and providing more bike parking and amenities at the station itself. So there's a bit of a different approach there.
That's super interesting, especially the economic approach to that. That makes a lot of sense, especially since cities are very often short on money, and there's always like a goal to save more money during the project. So that's a very interesting approach. Well, thank you both very, very much. I don't know, someone I think is typing another question, maybe, or I don't know, someone is typing, so maybe we wait like a few seconds and see if it's coming now. Oh yeah, there it is.
Oh.
So what are the average commuting distances in the city of Toronto?
Overall, like, you probably are wondering about when we put in transit and driving and walking as well.
Oh, average commuting distance. So they're 10 kilometers on average. So if you look at all modes of transportation, it's 10 kilometers. So that's why in the downtown area, because most people are trying to get to the central business district in the south center of Toronto, so that's why the emphasis, so in the outer area where more people are traveling farther distances to get downtown, we don't expect them to make those long 10-kilometer journeys. So the emphasis there is just to try and get them to transit. So then that could be sort of a competitive. The cycling and transit combination can be the competitor to the car in terms of travel time. So improving access to stations and making that travel time reduction possible is, I guess, the key piece why we focus on transit and that analysis we did.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, looking at the time, we're really perfect with the time actually right now. So exactly like scheduled. Thank you both very, very much for this really interesting presentation about your innovative approach in Toronto. I was very happy to have you both here in the webinar, and also thanks again to our Italian guests and our presenters, of course, and yeah, to our listeners from Germany and also from the world. I just want to show you very briefly, we're just pulling up the presentation right now, just a quick outlook on our next webinars that we will have very soon. So next Monday, actually, there is another webinar that has a rather international context. So it's going to be about the Efficiency House Plus. The title is Effizienzhaus Plus. Efficiency House Plus goes international. So we will have presentations, for example, from Melbourne, from Australia in this webinar, also the Chinese approach to the Efficiency House Plus concept. So that is next Monday on the 23rd. Just a quick side note, it sounds as if it was an English webinar. It's actually in German, so don't get confused, please. And then on the 10th of October, we have a webinar about urban farming, also in German. And then on the 23rd of October, there's another webinar planned, which is about serielles Bauen, serial building. Yeah, so these are the next 3 webinars we will have scheduled here in the Efficiency House Plus. And yeah, thank you again, everyone, for the super interesting presentations. I hope our listeners enjoyed the presentations and the webinar. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact us. We can also forward your questions to the presenters. And yeah, you can also see the link down here at the slide. It says register. Here you can also see basically the next times and dates for the next webinar is also the recording from this webinar. So feel free to share it with your colleagues if you thought it was interesting, or if you want to watch something again. It will probably be online in about a week or so. Yeah, so that's all from here. Thank you again from Berlin. All the best, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. And I hope to see you soon again. Thank you very much.